All right, so we're about to be live any minute now. And then got it. Okay. Okay, so people will still be joining, which is fine. And we'll just start. So welcome everyone to our presentation tonight. I have to say our Brexit talks are always very popular, so it'll tell you the level of interest and possibly the level of uncertainty around what all of this means. We have tonight a return visit for both of our speakers, Dr. Richard Aldous and Dr. Peter Moloney. You probably remember Dr. Aldous is the Eugene Meyer Professor of British History and Culture down at Bard University, and he taught me in Ireland, even though he's very young and I'm incredibly young as well. And Peter Moloney, PhD, has been a long-time speaker here at the museum. He was teaching up at Skidmore and he took part in the Carroll Lecture Series. So tonight we're going to discuss Brexit, British politics, the implications of the protocol for Northern Ireland and the Good Friday Agreement, as well as, of course, the whole economic outlook and the implications this will have for elections in May. I will just say we're on a webinar tonight, so the audience will have to use either the Q&A. If you hover your mouse on the screen of your computer, the Q&A function will pop up, or you can just type it in chat. So we'll just get the ball rolling generally here, and then you can start asking your questions almost immediately in the Q&A feature or chat, and I'll call them out. And the same for those of you on YouTube, you can type your questions in the comments there. So welcome to you both. Thank you so much for joining us. The wonders of technology, we can all be in the comfort of our homes or offices. And so I guess we'll start off, if you just want to maybe define for us or tell people exactly what is it that we mean when people are talking about the protocol, and how does this tie into the Good Friday Agreement and the Brexit Agreement itself? I don't mind which of you wants to take it.
I can take that first. So the protocol is basically a part of the overall Brexit agreement that the British and the European Union agreed on. Was it last year, 2 years ago? I don't know. They've agreed on so many things. But the protocol was designed to satisfy two different issues. One was Britain, UK, leaves the customs union, leaves the single market, goes off on its own, to take over, can't say take over the world, to trade with the world. And the other side of it was the protocol was designed to keep Northern Ireland in the European single market for goods only, while still being in the UK. So it's a kind of a purgatory, or very happy purgatory, in fact, because I just saw today they're doing pretty well in Northern Ireland. But I'm sure we'll get to that later. It was designed as a political mechanism to maintain peace in Ireland while allowing the UK to leave the European Union, and that's pretty much it in a nutshell.
And Richard, why is there, sometimes it seems to be almost kind of hysterical about, oh, we'll trigger the protocol, or, we will or we won't. Who is not happy with it? Like, it seems to be unsure that maybe it's just the unionists aren't happy, because there seems to be now, from their point of view, a kind of a division between them and Great Britain, particularly when it comes to trade, which, as Peter said, is actually probably beneficial in the long run, but they're not feeling like they're part of the unit anymore.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And I mean, first of all, can I just say how nice it is to be back at the Irish American Heritage Museum and back and seeing you, as you said in your introduction. I mean, you're a wonderful student, so it's fantastic to see how well you've done, and it's really nice to be back discussing Brexit with Peter. I think that, actually one of the things that we always forget about Brexit, it was forgotten in 2016 and we still continue to forget it, is that so many of the issues around Brexit are actually cultural. So we very often think, oh, it's all about a calculation about trade and prosperity and goods coming in and goods coming out and imports and exports and all of these kind of things. But so many of the issues are actually as much about what people feel in their hearts and in their guts, if you like, as they are about these kind of cold calculations. Because exactly as Peter said, that the protocol, when you look at it in a very detached kind of a way, exactly as he said, it's a kind of a best of all worlds, really, for Northern Ireland, that it manages to have all of the benefits of being part of the United Kingdom, and all of the benefits effectively of being still in the single market and having that trading relationship, obviously with the Republic of Ireland, but also then with the European Union more broadly. So if you look at it just in terms of cold, hard logic, then everybody should be happy. But of course, people don't look at it in that way, that cultural issues do matter. And I think for the unionist community, for the Protestant community in Northern Ireland, the fact that there seems to be some kind of border in the Irish Sea between Britain and Northern Ireland is a problem, and it's a cultural problem. And I think that's really, and I'm sure we'll go on to kind of discuss this a bit more, and that's the problem. It is interesting, though, exactly as you said, that we need to kind of be careful that we don't talk about the unionist perspective. I mean, at the moment, the unionist view is incredibly fragmented. It's one of the reasons that so much support is hemorrhaging away from the DUP, from the Democratic Unionist Party. But it's hemorrhaging in two different directions. It's hemorrhaging towards the Ulster Unionists and the Alliance parties, the kind of more traditionally more moderate parties, but it's also going in the opposite direction towards the new Unionist Party, which has been founded, which is much more hardline. So, you know, I think that kind of unionism is in a crisis, trying to work out what's really in Northern Ireland's best interests.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that is yesterday. I think the days are blending, but yesterday was basically the anniversary of Randolph Churchill's visit, you know, to Ulster, where he gave this huge talk in Belfast and allegedly said, you know, Ulster will fight and Ulster will be right. But he was talking about the Home Rule Bill in 1886, and so I think it's an interesting point, Peter, like that the unionist is actually fragmenting it. It's not necessarily unionist against nationalist. It is the unionist, which is a very intriguing problem, really, because, as you said, like, it's amazing in a way that culture would kind of trump the economic benefit, which they're clearly benefiting from, and the fact that actually Ulster voted to remain in the European Union to begin with. And so, you know, can you speak a little bit about that and maybe talk about the DUP leadership? Like, what does it mean now that Paul Girvan or whatever resigned, you know, and so where are we now with the DUP in particular?
Yeah, so I think that the DUP, as Richard said, is definitely in crisis, and the unionist movement itself is, partly because if you define yourself as a unionist, you're united to what? For the unionists, it's London, it's the Crown, right? And if the Crown has kind of sold you down the Swanee a little bit, or has kind of not really taken your views into account in signing the protocol in the first place, then that's a real grounds for crisis, because your entire reason for being, in a sense, has been undermined. And that's really, and I think outsiders need to understand that, that's really scary and frustrating for the unionist population. The resignation of the First Minister and then the kind of triggering of the fall of the Stormont Assembly and the government there, it was kind of theatrical, but in reality, I mean, they weren't even functioning for 3 years, from like 17 to 20, if I remember correctly, and the world went on. It's a little bit theatrical. They're trying to play the long game for the elections in May. You know, making their stand now and building momentum before May. But the problem is, May is 3 months away. By US standards, that's a blink in terms of electioneering. But by Irish standards and British standards, a lot can happen in 3 months that can totally undermine the unionist position. And it's a risky move, but they obviously felt it was necessary at the time.
And Richard, just picking up on that point, you know, I read highlights or headlines today that were saying, you know, Sinn Féin might become actually the number one sort of party that the DUP support is hovering at about 14%. You know, the UUP, and we talked about this the last time you guys were on, how the fringes had actually become more mainstream. So like the DUP, which had been further out, was now actually more, you know. So what, and I think we probably have to talk about Boris Johnson a little bit, like, you know, how is the British what's going on in Britain and with their party. Like, is the Johnson government going to last? I mean, it looks like his storm in a teacup is over, to be honest, in terms of the COVID parties and all of that. But what is Britain's position on this, on Ulster?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of really good points in there. I mean, on your first point, you're absolutely right that, and Peter will know more about this than me, but the polling suggests that because the unionist side is so fragmented, that at the moment Sinn Féin is ahead in the polls. It's the leading party. Kind of Michelle O'Neill would, in all likelihood, be the person who would be entitled to be First Minister. But then, of course, because of the complicated way in which the Assembly government works there, then whoever was second, whichever of the leading unionist parties was in second, would have to consent to be Deputy First Minister and kind of so on. So it will get very, very messy very quickly. I think, and you're absolutely right to point out that the British side of this really does matter on all kinds of ways. That, I mean, you even saw it when Paul Given resigned. The British government, after Edwin Poots had said that they wouldn't enforce the kind of the customs checks anymore. In the past, the British government has always stepped right in and said, well, we are going to enforce them. But it was much more reticent about doing that this time. And one of the reasons for that is because the more kind of hardline Brexiteer members of the Conservative Party, the so-called European Research Group, they are putting pressure on Boris Johnson to be much more Brexity, if you like, much more aggressive in the way that they treat the European Union. They are urging him to trigger Article 16. Maybe we'll kind of come on to that, but effectively that would be a way of scrapping the kind of protocol, crudely put. So he's getting that pressure. And as you said, one of the reasons why he has to take care about that pressure is because he himself is under threat. His own position is under threat for various kind of reasons, including those controversial Downing Street parties. But it's not just the kind of the parties; it's also the way in which, when the kind of the impact that has had on the kind of the public opinion poll ratings of the Conservatives and so on. I mean, if you think about Boris Johnson, it's a fascinating situation because his political narrative for the next election, which it would probably be around 2024, possibly 23, but his narrative would be very clear. It would be, I delivered Brexit, I delivered the vaccines, we're out of the pandemic. Now that is a very powerful narrative for somebody to go into an election campaign. And yet, if you look at all the pollings, all the polling data, his personal rating is kind of very low. The Labour Party is now definitely challenging the Conservative Party kind of more broadly. So, a lot of those Conservative MPs are very nervous. They're waiting to see what will happen with the report that comes in on the Downing Street parties. They're waiting to see what happens in the May elections that will take place in England, to see whether Conservative support has dropped and what impact that will have. So, this is a febrile time in Northern Ireland politics, in British politics, of course, even in European politics, with the French elections are coming up. There's all the problems going on, obviously, that you mentioned in Ukraine, which are putting strains on the kind of Europe, kind of more kind of generally. So yeah, this is a fascinating but difficult time on all kinds of levels.
And I want Peter, you to talk about the Dublin response in a minute, but I was just thinking it has been such a hallmark of, in a way, unionist politics and conservative politics in Britain, that they're so often intertwined and sometimes dependent. Like minority governments kind of in Britain that are dependent on this unionist backbenchers or balance of power, and that we're kind of back to that like 100 years after partition, is a little bit shocking. And I think, even though this was supposed to be kind of the triumph of Britain, I suppose, pulling out of Europe, they might be kind of sucked back in diplomatically a little bit because of Ukraine. And so how they treat, Brexit might be affected by the need for allying, there. So it's as you say, it's interesting. Come ahead, Richard. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I would say about that, though, is that a lot of the kind of Brexiteers, one of their arguments was always, we are leaving the European Union, but we are not leaving Europe. So in some ways, I think it's quite. I'll give you an example that this week, the joint Brexit committee between Britain and the European Union met to discuss kind of things like the protocol.
Mm-hmm.
Did anyone notice that in the papers? No, there was very little that. And at a different time, that would have been very much a kind of a headline. There would have been talk about, either kind of confrontation or rapprochement or kind of something. But obviously, all eyes were on the Ukraine. And so, what British politicians have always argued is that these are exactly the kind of issues where kind of Britain and the European Union through institutions like NATO, where they would still all be able to work together. So, I think in an odd kind of a way, the Ukraine crisis is kind of something that kind of helps to make that argument that Brexit is not a kind of all or nothing. It's not Britain withdrawing. It's just a very particular kind of relationship, because it would be unthinkable for Europe to confront the problem in Ukraine without the involvement of the British.
Yeah. So Peter, let's kind of backtrack a bit maybe and talk about, our Dublin sitting back a little bit. Are they hoping that it will sort of do its own thing without them being too involved? I think they're maybe taking a very softly approach. We had talked before about how they had jumped in, for instance, to ensure that the Erasmus program was still open to students in Northern Irish universities, so there's this kind of soft diplomacy going on. But what's their attitude otherwise?
Yeah, so I mean, the Irish government have been kind of not taking a back seat, that's too indirect, but they've definitely been going softly. They're kind of understanding that COVID has really stressed everybody out for a start. So that's a very high baseline of stress. And Brexit has been kind of, the whole process has been kind of going on. It's become more administrative rather than political at the moment. So it's boring, which is sometimes good. I mean, Ukraine's not boring, but that's bad. So, when it's just talking, then that's good. So Dublin has been careful. One thing I'll say about Dublin is that they have been, for the past year or two, deliberately, they kind of no longer can treat the UK as obviously part of the European Union. But what they have been doing is opening consulates in, I think, Manchester and Cardiff, and they already have one up in Scotland, to basically lobby the local community for business, for cultural exchange, or just connection, because they no longer meet the British diplomats on a daily basis in the EU context. And the Irish meet everybody else, but they needed to set up almost special appointments to meet the British, which is a bit ad hoc and not like what they've been used to for 45 years. So that's taken a bit of time to get used to. But I have noticed that the Irish have, especially in terms of trade, they've definitely upped the ante in just treating the regions of Britain as entities in themselves. That sounds very kind of very theoretical, but they've increased their trade with the Scottish and the Welsh, and I can talk later about Northern Ireland. Like the trade is
amazing figures, in the last week or two.
I think the trade between the Republic and Northern Ireland has increased by like 50% in the past year. Because Northern Ireland businesses are now sourcing more in the south because it's less hassle, less cost. And equally in the Republic, they're sourcing from the north because it's less hassle, less cost than what they used to do from Britain. And so the British trade has decreased, whereas the internal Irish trade has actually increased dramatically.
And I mean that, again, the COVID, supply chains and all of this, there's so many things going on that had one of them not happened, you wonder. Richard, do you want to talk to us a little bit about then Article 16, I think, and just, explain to everybody what that is and who might wield it,
Yeah, and just to pick up briefly too on a couple of points that Peter raised, I think the other thing that strikes me, and it's always very difficult to actually kind of pin this kind of thing down, but I do find it quite interesting, the shift from Leo Varadkar to Micheál Martin as Taoiseach, that, kind of Leo Varadkar is a much more, kind of in many ways, a much spikier kind of a character. His rhetoric, I think, is a lot more forceful, whereas kind of Micheál Martin seems to me to be a much more, his rhetoric is a lot more emollient. And I think that's definitely taken some of the heat out of some of the kind of the exchanges on these kind of things. I'm not necessarily saying that one is better than the other. I mean, obviously, different kind of diplomacy suits a particular kind of moment. And Leo Varadkar was incredibly important in getting the final deal kind of over the line. But it is striking that there is a different tone coming out of Dublin since Micheál Martin became Taoiseach. The other thing as well, you mentioned the pandemic, and I think that the pandemic in some ways reinforces the fact that even though Britain is no longer a member of the European Union, that there is still a different and a special relationship between Britain and Ireland, which is actually has a legal framework that kind of so many of our lives in the last kind of couple of years have been concerned about movement, freedom of movement. And that even though obviously there have been severe restrictions on all of us at different times, nevertheless, that the freedom of movement between Britain and Ireland has been easier than kind of most places, between most kind of countries. So I think that, again, the relationship is so complicated and so subtle that we're only really beginning to tease out a lot of these kind of things, exactly as Peter said, that that it had got into a certain way of doing things since 1973, when kind of both countries joined the European Union, but they're now kind of reverting almost to that older relationship that existed before EU membership, and just having to remind ourselves of what that actually entails. A kind of Article 16 in many ways is a kind of fairly straightforward thing, that the British Prime Minister could trigger Article 16 and effectively pull out of the agreement. And that kind of protocol, if it kind of broke down, then it's kind of even built into that actually that the people of Northern Ireland themselves will have a kind of a veto over whether it continues, because it will be it will become an electoral issue, and if they vote against it, then the thing will collapse. So there are lots of hurdles to be jumped before this thing is worked out.
So then, Peter, I suppose not that Article 16 would trigger that, but we hear a lot of talk about border polls and all of that. So if Article 16 was triggered, which would technically, am I right in saying, would open up trade technically between the north of Ireland and the UK again, mainland kind of thing, and put back in place the border between the north of Ireland, and ostensibly then Europe as well. So what is the border poll to do with that, or is it a separate thing, or will we have a border poll?
Sorry, just to interrupt there, that it's very important to say that Britain has said that it would not impose the border between Northern Ireland. So it would be, they've made, their argument is that it would be up to the European Union if it wanted to impose a border. which the EU has said it would need to do in order to preserve the integrity of the single market.
Of the trade and the market,
but it is important, I think, to get that distinction.
Yeah. Is that kind of a cop-out, though, like on the part of the Brit? It's very easy to say they won't enforce something that they know Britain or Europe has to enforce, you know what I mean? So it's, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I agree with Richard. It's definitely the British have a very literally a laissez-faire kind of open border policy attitude. But one thing that they know about goods coming from the European Union is that they have to legally be a certain standard. Mm-hmm. So it's not risky in that sense leaving in sausages from
Germany or wherever,
or Germany, whatever, because you know what you're dealing with. In the opposite direction, the EU does not know where this food or product is coming from necessarily, because part of the reason for Brexit was to diverge trade, to diverge standards, regulations. Yeah. So there's more uncertainty from the UK to Europe to EU rather than the other way around. But Article 16 is very interesting because it's been like a stick that's been shaken for the past year and a half, and no one's been hit yet. It is a little bit of a misnomer that it would kind of blow the whole door open in a sense, because the mechanism is actually very precise in terms of what the British government can do. What it effectively does is, if they can identify specific places, products or goods that they feel are being, discriminated against or unfair trading practices, they can, to an extent, open up the border and make it more difficult for the EU. But they do need to then negotiate. So it's a kind of it's not a revolutionary kind of blowing everything
all or nothing,
it's very much it's a very administrative process. So it's been used as a very very dynamic kind of exciting political fist, but in reality it's a light touch administrative. But
and we saw it in a kind of a shadow kind of a way, actually, with medicines, because although Article 16 wasn't triggered that was really the kind of, it seems that was probably the closest that we've come to it being triggered, because there was this kind of dispute about the kind of freedom for medicines to go from Britain to Northern Ireland and so on, and the kind of whether the EU would regulate that and kind of what that meant and kind of so on. And so obviously that was a very emotive kind of an issue, but it is interesting that's one of the things that they've done a deal on. And it kind of, I agree completely with what kind of Peter says about the kind of the administrative element of this, that's a kind of a good example of where kind of something was sorted out, actually in a very kind of technical, very pragmatic kind of a way, and maybe offers a kind of a template for the future.
Which I have to say, when we're talking about all of that stuff, brings us to America and the Good Friday Agreement, which I guess is the other side kind of triggering that do we think American diplomats are invested or as invested? I know certainly, and it was Richard, when you mentioned Leo Varadkar, like that was definitely a kind of a big stick that Ireland had, that Irish America was behind them, and America, and particularly then when Biden won the election too, which was a sort of a different administration. So, do we think America features in this for either side, or is it just sort of comforting to know that they're there?
I think as well that, this comes back to what we were talking about before, that where the kind of the realities of geopolitics can complicate things, that I think you're absolutely right. I don't think anybody doubts that kind of Joe Biden's identification as an Irish American is very strong. It's very real. I think I saw in the papers over the weekend that there's some talk that he may visit Ireland over the summer, and you can imagine that would be a very emotional occasion for him and also for Ireland itself. So, but as we said, we're in the middle of a major crisis now with Ukraine, and the reality is that if kind of Joe Biden wants to kind of pull the Western alliance kind of closer together, then he needs Britain. Britain contributes the most kind of in terms of kind of percentage of GDP, other than the United States, to NATO. It's kind of its kind of forces have always fought alongside the United States. I'm not saying, incidentally, that the US will be sending troops in. I mean, obviously, it's looking to do something different, but it's going to need Britain. Britain has a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council. All of these kind of things. So, I think that whether it's NATO, the UN Security Council, the nuclear deterrent, the military forces, the kind of diplomatic clout, all of these things means that Joe Biden is going to have to factor in all of these kind of things, and is not really going to be able to say to Britain, well, actually, we don't really care what you think, and to kind of hammer home the point about the Northern Ireland Protocol. I'm not saying that it won't continue to be important, because it will, but all I'm kind of trying to say is that it is going to be a kind of a complex situation for him, because he needs Britain.
Yeah, well, and that's exactly it. Putin and Ukraine has totally, come from, well, not left field, but that has certainly added a dimension that, we didn't have 2 years ago. Peter, do you want to say anything on that?
Yeah, no, funny, just on a quick aside, strangely enough, Ireland's also on the UN Security Council for the moment.
Yeah, this time.
So maybe we could have that as another forum for discussion. So yeah, no.
Although of course, because Britain is a permanent member, it has the veto. And that's always the important thing.
And it's a nuclear power, so that carries a lot of force as well. I just saw something recently where the Irish Army apparently is not even capable of defending the island of Ireland. So we're certainly not in the same position.
No. Although the fishermen in Cork did a great job against Russia. Yeah.
I didn't see any Kerry fishermen there.
Well, no, Joni from CNN was out there. That was grand. They didn't want the Kerry ones involved. It would have gotten hairy. Bob Melia, one of our members, is just mentioning it. For sure, I know one of the Irish American groups, the Ancient Order of Hibernians, are quite active, like, in making sure that there's motions passed, kind of, and proclamations issued in terms of getting declarations of support from America for the Good Friday Agreement. But I suppose there's really little chance of that actually, being blown up, sort of thing. Like, the Good Friday Agreement is in place, it's international law, aside from kind of whether Article 16 is triggered or not. But maybe, as you said, Richard, they won't be loudly announcing their support too much anymore, because they do have to kind of keep everybody on side.
I do think, though, that, I mean, coming back to the question, to the observation there, that, I mean, that kind of thing is important, because we have become, there's no question about it, that we have become incredibly complacent about the Good Friday Agreement. It was such a success. It worked so well. It was so thoughtful. I mean, it's one of the, I know that it's one of the resentments, I think, in Ireland about Brexit itself, that kind of during the Brexit debate, nobody really gave any thought to the implications of how the Good Friday was so kind of woven into, or rather the other way around, that European Union membership was really woven into making that kind of the Good Friday Agreement work, and so on. So, I do think that we have to kind of guard ourselves against saying, it'll be fine, don't worry, it'll be fine. Because there's no doubt that the kind of issues that we've been talking about, around the border, fears about a harder border, about surveillance of the border, that these things, as we know, can very easily become quite combustible.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about that, Peter?
Yeah, just one quick follow on. He's right. The whole Northern Ireland situation wasn't even. I did a word cloud recently on a slide, and I was kind of surprised in the end that, maybe I wasn't, that of all the topics spoken during the referendum campaign, Ireland was really almost not there.
Yeah.
And it, to me, shows two things. It shows, one, that they weren't paying attention, and two is, like, fundamentally Brexit is an English project, which the Scots and the Northern Irish voted against. The Welsh narrowly voted for, but they're also having kind of second thoughts. But it's fundamentally an English project, and I think we tend to forget that England and the UK obviously is not the same thing.
And that kind of brings me back to the DUP. We've just had a comment on from one of our viewers to say, and this is interesting because, we were talking about at the start that the DUP are maybe a minority party themselves, even out of the three different unionists, but, their own attitude kind of to Britain, and they have a different attitude. They had different laws on abortion and gay marriage than England did, even though they were supposed to. And so, what does that say about the DUP? That they're the ones actually sometimes wielding the stick, but they may not have either the strength of their own convictions, or they might not have the support of the populace. And so how, this saber rattling, is it dangerous, or is it just the last gasps of kind of this dying party, and then either a more extreme unionist party will come out of it, or Sinn Féin will come out of it? Or is that too extremist?
I think they've taken a gamble. They've taken a calculated gamble that
the DUP?
That hardcore unionism will get them over the line. And that's their prerogative. That's what they've decided to follow. The danger is they lose the more moderate part of their people in their party. I mean, it's not unlike the Conservatives in Britain before Brexit, when UKIP was stealing their votes because they were more extreme. They were all about the referendum to get out of Europe, whereas the Conservatives were more middle of the road. In order to get those voters back to the Conservative Party, they shifted their policy more towards UKIP than they probably felt comfortable doing.
But so they destroyed UKIP, in doing so.
Correct.
Yeah.
They also created Brexit. So, they're
silver linings.
collateral damage in that sense. Yeah. But the DUP is interesting because I think I would not define them as dying. Their DNA is struggle. Their DNA is standing up against the odds and taking a stand. They're like the Alamo Party in many ways, if you could kind of make the comparison. But in that sense, they shouldn't be underestimated. But they do represent an important part of the population. But my impression is that more as trade increases and as people appreciate in the North that they're getting the best of both worlds, then their reasoning against the protocol is more tribal, more as Richard said, than we're losing a ton of money because of this disaster. They're not. Northern Ireland exporters have never had it so good. So it's not a trade issue, it's a cultural and tradition issue.
But to that, Richard, is that culture even and tradition sort of, on the way out as well? We've had 20 years of peace, so there's a generation of this Good Friday, that maybe aren't marching on July 12th, or, there's a lot more cross-border kind of, there's still a lot of segregation, I guess, up there, sort of self-segregating in terms of schools and things. But that was, as you said, one of the benefits of the European Union, that, they could choose to call themselves European as opposed to declaring I'm Northern Irish or I'm British. And so do you think even culturally, is that, or are they in a renaissance now because they're panicking?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And I mean, you're absolutely right. We discussed it earlier that the kind of the European Union really or membership of the European Union was a kind of something that just allowed so many of these differences just to be elided, that you could be Irish, you could be British, you could be British and Irish, you could identify however you wanted, because ultimately everybody was a citizen of the European Union, and you had freedom of movement, and so all these kind of things tended to get absorbed. But as we were saying earlier, now those differences have kind of become much sharper, and they're politically sharper. as well. But it is interesting. This only really struck me when I was listening to what Peter was saying, that you do have a kind of a strange situation in some ways, because, you know, in Northern Ireland, you have this situation where even though it kind of seems to be working economically, very much to Northern Ireland's benefit, and the kind of figures support that, there's still this kind of sense of kind of anxiety and controversy surrounding the issue in Northern Ireland. Whereas in Britain, where the kind of the advantages of Brexit are still kind of being worked out, and still, you know, it's still unclear, partly because of the pandemic, what exactly kind of Brexit means. Actually, the kind of opinion polls show that Brexit isn't really an issue anymore, that it's kind of everything has kind of calmed down. The Economist actually was kind of pointing this out in its kind of big review of Brexit on that it brought out in the kind of for its 1st of January issue. And it made the point that, you know, actually Britain as a country has kind of is kind of beginning to move on from Brexit. It's not the kind of the divisive issue that it was kind of a couple of years ago. So, you know, in many ways I find that fascinating, that, you know, the kind of the culture, it talks about the cultural thing as well, that, you know, everything has kind of seems to have settled down in Britain, even though the economic stuff is still being worked out. Whereas in Northern Ireland, where it seems that the economic stuff really has been worked out in some ways, the cultural stuff is still kind of very sharp. So there's a kind of these are all kind of parts of the ironies, I think, that that kind of actually just make Brexit so difficult to analyze and to work out what's going on. And there's no doubt that the pandemic has made that doubly so. As we just scratch our heads and think, kind of how is this actually going to work itself out in the end?
You know, I remember when we did the panel, which must have been 2019. You know, we were in the old museum still, and it was definitely pre-pandemic with no sign of it on the horizon. We talked about this, that, you know, and I remember, Richard, you made the point that, like, you couldn't see that, like, Europe would all of a sudden deny sending drugs, you know, to, like, so the diabetics, like in England, weren't going to start dying in droves because they couldn't access. So how did any of that and you've just said it's very difficult to kind of judge that because of the pandemic and because of the Suez Canal that time and all of these different supply chain things. But, you know, every now and then I see articles in the paper about no asparagus available, you know, in Waitrose, or like, do they not grow their own, you know? So what is the situation in terms of, like, goods on the supermarket shelves? And some of that, as you said, is going to be pandemic related as opposed to Brexit related. But what is the reality on the ground over there?
Yeah, it's and precisely as you say, that, I mean, there is a kind of a global supply problem at the moment, and kind of supply chain problem that means it's really difficult to disentangle what's kind of Brexit related and what is just a global issue. I mean, it is interesting that in terms of imports, that this is the first time well, certainly this century, that Britain now has more imports coming from non-EU countries than it does from EU economies. So that is something that is different. And then, you know, you can look at these different indicators and say, well, you know, Britain was the fastest growing economy among the G7 in 2021. But again, that's complicated by the fact of the pandemic. So it makes it very difficult to judge what that means. It's predicted to be the kind of fastest growing of the G7 in 2022 as well. But again, you know, coming from the pandemic, when Britain, in terms of its investment, its pandemic funding was roughly 20%. The equivalent of 20% of GDP. So these things, you know, I give those as kind of examples. Employment, or rather unemployment, is down to 4%, which is kind of a record low since the 1970s. But you can present that in two different ways. You could say, well, you know, that's fantastic, that, but it also speaks to the fact that there are kind of problems getting workers. but is that problem getting workers because of the pandemic?
Yeah.
Or is that because there are no longer the kind of supply of labor coming, of people coming to work from the EU? So, you know, I know that I'm repeating myself, but I think it is actually worth it, worth kind of just making this point that the kind of the economic indicators and so on are just so difficult to understand. Maybe the most interesting kind of indication of all may be that Royal Dutch Shell, which had always been kind of able to split its self between Amsterdam and London because of the European Union, actually divorced itself from Amsterdam and now is an entirely kind of British-owned, London-owned, or listed anyway, London-listed company, which caused kind of great upset in the Netherlands itself. But it's a kind of an indication that, you know, the City of London still has a kind of a certain pulling power about it. Yeah. But everything is just so muddy. It's just really, really difficult to work out what is going on, partly because of the pandemic.
Yeah, and actually that's a good point too, Peter. You know, we did talk about that in 2019, that, you know, would Ireland kind of benefit? Were banks going to pull out wholesale, you know, and move the headquarters to Dublin? I don't think so, is the short answer. You know, there might have been a little bit, and I mean, Ireland has always been in a weird place anyway because of the corporate tax thing, which has now been sorted out, and, you know, so maybe maybe Dublin didn't benefit as much as they thought, you know, they might.
Yeah, because I mean, they weren't the only one that could have benefited. You got
you could go to Paris or someplace.
Yeah. Actually, I've heard that Belfast is booming in all areas, including financial services. Because again, being in the best of both worlds, it's like but the one thing I would say is that the City of London is a very
powerful
situation because it is, like, probably with New York, one of the two biggest powerful in the world. So the EU is being very careful, and they're kind of cutting them some slack and not making, because that would be cutting off your nose to spite your face. You just need to,
because they need the money, they need the finance themselves.
I think I read something where there's more euros are cleared in London than the entire EU put together. You know, it's just a huge market, and you can't ignore that fact that it's not replaceable. It did have some leakage. It did have some companies, banks departing, but not wholesale. You know, they were opening up offices elsewhere with tens of people rather than hundreds or thousands.
Yeah. And then, you know, somebody has commented too, it's hard, I suppose, to kind of judge this, and we've maybe talked around it. What is the likelihood, or is there a likelihood? Because it really does appear, I know we said at the start that sometimes, you know, particularly Johnson and the Conservative Party are kind of careful to, you know, massage the unionist vote in the north. But is it increasingly looking like actually the United Kingdom doesn't think that much about Northern Ireland and doesn't see it as centrally a partner as the unionists would see themselves, you know? And so is there some kind of inevitability at one point to, or inevitable might be too strong a word, but the likelihood of some sort of leaving the United Kingdom, and whether that means being, you know, their own separate state or coming back into a 32 county Ireland. There was some very interesting talks, you know, all last year about what would that look like for Ireland, and we wouldn't be able to use the same flag, and you know, it was very interesting because I certainly hadn't really thought of that, like that, you know, it would mean compromise on the part of the southern counties too, you know. So is that something that's still very far off in the distance, or is it more likely now post-Brexit, or where are we?
I think first of all, it really wasn't an issue until Brexit, and then Brexit put it on the table. So that's point one. Also, I think it's made it more likely, but still not in the short term. I think what the British government had realized is that their trade, I keep going back to trade, but there's more to it than that. But like it's the English exporters who've really suffered from Brexit, whereas the Northern Irish exporters are in the best of both worlds. So that was not predicted in a sense, and it's caught them by surprise, and they're really trying to play catch up on that, just to kind of balance things out more. But I don't know. I think the South would have to vote yes, and the North would have to vote yes, and on both sides there's definitely, it's no guarantee. It's definitely up for grabs, but it makes for interesting future. I think you're right. I think if there was a United Ireland in the next whatever 10, 20, 30 years, it would not be our grandfathers' nationalism. It would have to be different. And are Southerners willing to let that go? I don't know. It depends.
I think as well that one of the other aspects that's kind of interesting about that one of the reasons why I think there's a tension between the Conservatives in the UK and the kind of the Unionists in Northern Ireland is because although the kind of the Conservative Party is obviously conservative, it's actually by and large it's not socially conservative. That's personified by Boris Johnson himself. Whereas, of course, the unionism, I mean, you mentioned some of these kind of controversial issues like kind of abortion, for example, that unionism is far more socially conservative in Northern Ireland. And so there's a kind of a conflict there. But also then when you then start thinking about the Republic of Ireland now is actually one of the most socially liberal countries in the European Union, in Western Europe. That the recent kind of referendum on kind of issues like divorce and kind of abortion and these kind of issues on kind of same-sex marriage. So it's if these are the kind of issues that, exactly as Peter said, these are not the kind of things perhaps that people were talking about in their kind of grandfather's generation, but those would kind of become incredibly important, I think, in any discussions about a united Ireland, and it would be interesting to see how people voted. Is it a given that ultimately kind of the achievement of that kind of aim since the foundation of the state 100 years ago, the fulfillment of that aim of a united Ireland, would that ultimately be the thing that would get it over the line, or would people have reservations in the privacy of the polling booth, the voting booth, that they wouldn't necessarily express in public? I mean, who knows?
Yeah, we've just had a comment. Sorry, Peter, and I'll go back to you then. Someone, Patricia, said the Sinn Féin leading polls in North and even in the South, I guess too, the Irish unity is closer than we think. But that is, like, I attended a conference, I think Trinity College held it, virtually, and it was a unionism kind of forum, and they were saying, like the flag, absolutely not. And, here am I thinking, well, the flag was specifically designed to have peace between the green and the orange. And, of course we would use the same flag. But, they've been burning it in effigy for 100 years. So they would not be happy. But, and then I'm thinking, well, would I be happy with the designed flag? And somebody else was saying even the name, that Ireland might not be the name that we would use. So all of a sudden, like from a, just a Southern perspective, not necessarily, a nationalist or Republican perspective, it has become all of a sudden a more complicated question than just, oh yeah, sure, come in and we'll somehow replicate, the British healthcare system, and we'll somehow do all of these things that you're used to up there. Now it's kind of coming to ephemeral identity, cultural questions, which is how we started. And that's a sort of different, it's more difficult, I think, to grapple with.
I do think that the questioner's point is an important one, though. That let's not forget that only by what was it, 0.5% or kind of 1% at most, that Sinn Féin was actually the largest party at the last election in the Republic. It could well be the largest party in the elections in May. That would present a very interesting political dynamic, I think. And so it would give Mary Lou McDonald, I think, kind of a certain authority to speak as the kind of the leader of the largest party in both states.
Yeah.
I think also I'm kind of projecting forward here, but if Sinn Féin was the largest party in North and South and it pushed for a united Ireland, like UKIP's sole purpose was to create a referendum on the EU membership. And once their reason for being kind of disappeared. And my wonder is if Sinn Féin achieves this goal, which is kind of the chalice, the holy grail of Irish nationalism, then where do they go from there? They have to definitely reconsider what their purpose is. I think that would be interesting. And also the other thing is, in the South, at least, Sinn Féin, through basic gerrymandering by the other parties, has not been allowed to be in power. Yeah. Now, there's a positive and a negative there for Sinn Féin. The positive is they don't have to take the blame for anything because they don't have power. And the negative is that they're untried, they're untested. And if 6 months or a year in government makes them unpopular, that can happen. I feel like in Europe in general, extreme parties, people are running scared, and that's building their momentum. Whereas if you incorporate them into a coalition, you kind of dampen down their ability to make change, extreme change, and you kind of bring a dose of reality to their policies very often. Like we just can't do that because we have so many different interests. You have to change your policy. So I think being in power would make it a more mature party, but it would make it a different party.
Yeah, and I will say, in a way too, the decade of centenaries at home has been interesting. It's forced us to grapple with certain things. Like, I can't believe they're stopping the wall, for instance, the memorial wall at Glasnevin or wherever it was, with some of the RIC soldiers' names were up there. And now somebody just commented on YouTube that the DUP have already committed to not power share with Sinn Féin in the north. So that kind of tips hands a little bit too, maybe. I don't know where we are going from there, but yeah. So we don't have any more questions. I'm surprised. I think everyone is shocked and awed. Does anyone on YouTube, I'm checking YouTube, or Zoom, have a question or a comment? I've dealt with them as they popped up here in the webinar, but maybe you've been answering all the questions before they had a chance to ask them. And I think, to be honest, I think it's just great to be able to kind of give this informative sort of session where we're trying to interpret what's going on. And it sometimes is kind of difficult, I think, to get into what all of these different things mean. And I suppose that is the hardest question, is what will it mean for the future, in terms of Ireland and peace. But hopefully it was not the disaster that everybody thought that it would be. Then even with the pandemic and those complications, that didn't upset everything either too much, and so life goes on as normal, which seems to be the thing. And I suppose if we can just maintain the peace, which sometimes looks a small bit rocky up in the north, we had that journalist killed a couple of years ago, and so you would hope that those things don't build back up. But if we can just now get past this mess with Putin and the Ukraine, maybe we'll have time to move past it. But I think there's not going to be anything life-changing, happening in the north of Ireland or Ireland for a while. Let's hope.
Maybe just jump in there. I think one thing we haven't mentioned is worth mentioning is Scotland.
Yeah.
They are looking very keenly at what's happening in the north, because they are, like the north, a devolved region of the UK. So whatever gifts or whatever advantages the north gets for political and trade reasons, you can bet your bottom pound that the Scots will be looking for something similar. And I'm not sure when the next election is there, but if the SNP gets a majority and they request a referendum, that opens up a whole other Pandora's box that could have effects on the other regions of the UK.
And I have to say, even though I haven't been following it incredibly closely, it is interesting to see just how the scandals with even the royal family, are kind of opening up a little bit of talk. This Andrew thing and even Harry and Meghan leaving. There's conversations being had even just around that maybe will loosen the bonds of the United Kingdom a little bit, that have nothing really to do, I guess, with politics. They're the head of state. But Richard, do you want to comment on any of those?
Yeah, and you can, I mean, it's kind of in some ways you can see this as kind of part of a broad historical trend, can't you? Because if you look back to the 19th century, the ties that held the United Kingdom together were really, really strong, because they were the kind of the part of the ties of empire. That Scotland, for example, was kind of places like Glasgow were one of the principal engines, the kind of dynamos of kind of empire and expansion and so on. But once the empire had gone, then a lot of the kind of the ties as well between the different countries and parts of the United Kingdom began to fragment. So is that kind of part of a kind of an overall kind of purpose of a kind of movement? We're kind of yet to see. I don't know about Scotland. I mean, of course, the difference between Scotland and Northern Ireland is that Northern Ireland has that kind of peace imperative, if you like, that made Britain and the European Union. It kind of made them come together in a way to try and make that work because of peace. That imperative is not there. If Scotland breaks away, they're kind of pretty much on their own. Countries like Spain have made it clear that they won't allow kind of Scotland to join the European Union, because that has implications for kind of the various territories of Spain, kind of the Basque region, and kind of so on. So, I don't know. And given kind of all of the kind of questions around currency, for Scotland not to have the pound sterling, to be outside of the euro, because it's so effectively to be a kind of an independent currency, having to depend on their own reserves. I mean, that's going to be a really brave decision, I think. A really,
I wonder,
really
Richard, if and you're right, I agree. It's Scotland is hard to see how it can survive on its own financially and trade-wise. But I wonder if the process of getting to that point will sufficiently undermine the union to kind of make it, to lead towards its breakup, or at least its distancing. Because you can be sure, even if Scotland fails to be independent, there will be a large section of the population who will resent this. And what does that mean? I don't know exactly, but it's probably going to have some consequences. The other thing I had a question for you too was, we heard recently where the Queen got COVID, 95, so she's pushing on a bit. Do you think, in terms of British unity and specifically towards the unionist population in the north, do you think that her probably not too long demise will trigger something or make a difference, or does it matter?
I definitely think it does matter. When you say demise, let's hope that's a long way off. But I mean, her own mother, I think, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, lived to 101, 102, something like that. So, there's
keep drinking the gin.
Yes,
pickling is good.
kind of exactly. But I think that your broader point is a really, really important one. That so much about not just the United Kingdom, but also the kind of the wider British world, in some sense, particularly through the Commonwealth and so on, is invested in the very person of the Queen herself. I mean, she's been Queen for literally 70 years now. There's a huge well of personal affection for her, which has not always been the case. I think, I mean, I can look back to the Silver Jubilee, which I can remember in 1977, and there was not the kind of the same level, but now there really is. And so, I think, yes, you're absolutely right that there will be implications for Britain, but also for Australia, for New Zealand, Canada, and so on.
Some Caribbean countries pulled out recently.
They did, yeah, exactly. So I think these questions will be important, and the fact that it's I think it's pretty commonly agreed that the Queen's slightly gnomic nudge during the referendum on Scottish independence last time. I mean, it was really nothing more than just the most oblique reference, but everybody knew that it was just a slight kind of push sort of in one direction. I think, probably did help to make a bit of a difference. So yeah, I think that these kind of things are going to be important. It's just, I mean, it comes back to the same thing that actually has been the constant of this conversation, that it's kind of cultural gut instinct things versus kind of rational, common sense, kind of hard-headed decision making. Because, actually, just as we were talking about Northern Ireland at the beginning, Scotland is in many ways is in exactly the position that Northern Ireland is in some ways, that it's got the best of both worlds. It's got its own parliament with a kind of, a very powerful first minister, but it's still part of the United Kingdom, that kind of powerful trading area. It's under the Barnett formula. It gets kind of massive investment in the country. To kind of underpin kind of all its kind of infrastructure and investment and kind of so on. So, it has the kind of the best of both worlds, but these kind of cultural kind of issues, this is a question of, do you see yourself as being an independent country? Do you see yourself standing on your own 2 feet? These things can have a draw. And if Brexit has taught us anything, it has been that sometimes people will vote against what is perceived as being, or what they're told is their economic best interests, for things that are more visceral and to kind of do with gut and heart more than they are with head.
And if Britain becomes Republican, it will be very interesting, because that will, I think, have knock-on effects. We've just had a question. I've wondered if there's ever a possibility of a federation kind of government among Scotland, Northern Ireland and the Republic. I know in Western Northern Ireland, the Protestants have a stronger identity with Scotland over England. I mean, I'd say some people would love it.
It would be a hell of a rugby team, that's for sure.
Yeah.
It'd be bad news for the Lions, though.
Yeah. I suppose that probably couldn't really work.
If 2 of those 3 can't even get on now, then adding a third into the mixture, does that just make it more difficult? So it's interesting, but I don't know. That's a good one.
I don't know that Southern Ireland would have any interest in it. It'd be even less kind of power for themselves in Dublin, So guys, we went a good bit over time, but I think you've held our audience enthralled, because nobody's asking questions except Betty there. Thank you, Betty, for that in the end. My parents tuned in from Ireland, so they're delighted. And they said to say hello, but they're going to bed. Yeah. So I want to thank both our panelists, Dr. Peter Moloney and Dr. Richard Aldous. That was an amazing conversation. I think you've really not dumbed it down for us, but it was a very stimulating conversation, and I think has given us certainly some food for thought. I got to think about what we're doing at the museum. Bob says thank you. Saturday we have a concert with Triscaeli to kick off our St. Patrick's month of Irish American heritage. So that'll be online through Facebook, and then on Sunday in person for members we have a meeting with Martino Melior, who was, as you probably will remember, the first Catholic and Sinn Féin mayor of Belfast, Lord Mayor of Belfast, and so he was very progressive and did ecumenical breakfast and all that. He is now the owner of the Irish Echo newspaper. And then next week we have a talk with Peter Quinn and Terry Galway, Irish America, Past, Present and Future. And so that will be amazing. They're 2 of my favourite writers for Irish American identity and memory and journalism and all that. And then, of course, our soda bread competition on the 5th and our 5K and 10K sweater run for St. Patrick's Day. So, and then back to the museum for music and dance and food and everything. So thank you both very much. Keep an eye on our Facebook page. This talk will be on our YouTube channel. They're all saying terrific session. Thank you and Gurv Mahagut, and good night, everyone. And thank you both to our panelists. I really enjoyed having you both back, and we'll have to do it again. Actually, I think, Dr. Aldous, you have a book coming out soon, so we're going to get you back to talk about that. Is it out already?
Wonderful.
Was it your...
No,
yeah.
Not yet.
No, good. Okay, yeah. Good. So thank you very much, and everyone have a great night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
so much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.